At my billionaire grandfather's will reading, everyone in the room inherited millions of dollars except me. I still remember the way the silence settled over that Manhattan penthouse after Walter Pierce finished reading the final page of the will. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly above us, reflecting against marble floors polished so perfectly I could almost see my own nervous expression staring back at me. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the November skyline shimmered in cold silver light. But inside that room, the Hayes family looked warm and comfortable, like people who had already won long before they arrived. My cousin Blake leaned back in his leather chair with the relaxed confidence of someone born expecting the world to belong to him. His navy suit probably cost more than my monthly rent in Brooklyn. Beside him, my Aunt Cynthia crossed one elegant leg over the other while adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist, barely hiding the satisfaction in her smile each time another inheritance figure was announced. $20 million to Blake. The Palm Beach estate to Cynthia. Shares in Hayes Global divided among relatives I barely even recognized. Every few minutes, someone whispered, "Richard was so generous," while sipping champagne poured by uniformed staff near the fireplace. I sat quietly near the far end of the table, my plain black dress suddenly feeling painfully out of place among all the designer labels and polished smiles. My grandfather, Richard Hayes, had built one of the largest investment firms in the country. Financial magazines called him a visionary. News anchors called him ruthless. To the family, he was simply the source of endless wealth. But to me, he was the only person in that room who had ever looked at me like I mattered. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 14, the rest of the family treated me like an uncomfortable reminder of something unfortunate they preferred not to discuss. They sent birthday cards signed by assistants. They forgot graduations. They remembered my existence only during Christmas photographs. But my grandfather never forgot. Sometimes he'd invite me to lunch alone and ask strange questions no one else cared about. "What's the one thing money can't buy, Eleanor?" he once asked while staring out over Central Park from the back seat of his car. I told him I didn't know. He smiled, but never answered his own question. And finally, Walter Pierce said calmly, adjusting his glasses as every eye in the room turned toward him, "To my granddaughter Eleanor Hayes." My heartbeat quickened. For one small second, I thought maybe my grandfather had remembered me after all. Walter reached beneath the conference table and placed a small wooden box in front of me. That was it. No check, no trust fund, no property. Just a worn wooden box about the size of a jewelry case. A quiet laugh escaped Blake's mouth before he could stop himself. Cynthia didn't even bother hiding her smile anymore. "Well," she said softly, lifting her champagne glass, "Richard always knew who truly belonged in this family." Heat rushed into my face, but I forced myself not to react. I simply rested my hands on the box and stared at the faded brass lock on the front. Around me, conversation slowly resumed as if I no longer existed. Millions of dollars had just changed hands, and somehow I had become invisible again. Then Walter Pierce leaned slightly closer to me, lowering his voice just enough so the others couldn't hear. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, "your grandfather left very specific instructions." I looked up at him. For the first time all afternoon, he didn't look cold or professional. He looked worried. "Do not open that box here." I carried the wooden box out of the penthouse with both hands resting tightly around it, as though someone might suddenly try to take it away from me. Behind me, the Hayes family continued celebrating inside the private dining room overlooking Midtown Manhattan. I could still hear the soft clinking of champagne glasses and distant laughter as the elevator doors slowly closed between us. The moment the elevator started descending, the silence around me felt almost unreal. My reflection stared back at me in the polished steel walls. 24 years old. Brown hair pinned back too simply for rooms like that. Shoes bought on clearance 6 months earlier. I looked nothing like the people upstairs. I never had. My grandfather used to tell me the Hayes family loved appearances more than honesty. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Standing alone in that elevator, I realized he had probably been warning me for years. Outside, cold November air swept through the streets as black SUVs lined the curb beneath the building. Drivers waited patiently for relatives who had just become even richer than they already were. I walked past them toward the subway station 3 blocks away because spending $40 on a rideshare home felt irresponsible when my checking account barely covered next month's rent. Halfway down Lexington Avenue, my phone buzzed. Blake Hayes. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. Well, he said the second I answered, his voice smooth with amusement. That was awkward. I stayed quiet. Come on, Eleanor. You cannot seriously look surprised. Grandfather respected ambition. You spent your life hiding in coffee shops and tiny apartments pretending money did not matter. I tightened my grip on the box. You already got everything you wanted, Blake. He laughed softly. Not everything. I am still curious what is inside your little consolation prize. Before I could answer, the line disconnected. I stood still on the crowded sidewalk for a moment while strangers rushed around me in winter coats, carrying shopping bags and paper coffee cups. For years, I told myself the distance between me and the rest of the Hayes family did not matter. I had my own life, my own job, my own tiny apartment in Brooklyn above a laundromat that rattled every night at 2 in the morning. But the truth was, rejection never really becomes normal. You simply learn how to carry it quietly. When I was 16, Aunt Cynthia forgot to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner and claimed her assistant had mixed up the mailing list. At 18, Blake laughed when he saw my community college acceptance letter because everyone else in the family attended Ivy League schools. Even after I transferred to Columbia on scholarship, they acted embarrassed whenever my name came up around business associates. To them, I was the poor branch of the family tree that should have disappeared years ago. Yet somehow, my grandfather always noticed things nobody else did. He remembered I hated oysters. He asked about my exams. Once, during a Christmas party at the Hamptons estate, he found me sitting alone near the kitchen and handed me a cup of hot chocolate himself because the staff had forgotten me. Never confuse wealth with character, Eleanor. He told me quietly while the rest of the family posed for photographs in the ballroom. The two rarely arrived together. I finally reached my apartment building just after 7. The hallway smelled faintly like detergent and old radiator heat. Inside my apartment, the noise from the laundromat vibrated softly through the floorboards while yellow streetlight filtered through the blinds. It was small, cluttered, and nowhere near luxurious, but it was mine. I placed the wooden box carefully on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. The brass lock looked older up close, scratched around the edges like someone had opened and closed it many times over the years. Then I noticed something I had missed before. Taped beneath the bottom of the box was a tiny folded piece of paper. My heartbeat slowed as I peeled it free. In my grandfather's sharp handwriting were only 6 words. Do not trust anyone named Hayes. I stared at the note for almost a full minute before I finally sat down at my tiny kitchen table. Outside my apartment window, traffic rolled steadily through the Brooklyn streets, while the laundromat downstairs hummed beneath the floor like distant machinery. Everything around me felt ordinary, but my grandfather's handwriting made the room feel strangely cold. Do not trust anyone named Hayes. The words repeated in my mind over and over again. My grandfather was not dramatic. He never wasted words. If he wrote something like that, he meant it. Slowly, I turned the wooden box over in my hands again. Up close, I noticed details I had missed earlier. Tiny scratches along the corners. Faded initials carved underneath the brass lock. RH. The box was older than I thought. Maybe decades older. I reached carefully for the clasp and hesitated. Walter Pierce's warning echoed in my head. Do not open that box here. At the time, I assumed he meant inside the penthouse. Now I was not so sure. My phone buzzed again across the table, making me jump slightly. This time it was Aunt Cynthia. I let it ring twice before answering. Eleanor, she said smoothly, her tone almost sweet, which usually meant she wanted something. I hope you made it home safely. I leaned back in my chair without answering immediately. Cynthia Hayes never called just to be kind. That is generous of you, I said quietly. You sound upset, she replied. Listen, I know today may have felt embarrassing for you. Richard had his reasons for everything. Embarrassing. The words settled heavily in my chest. She spoke about humiliation the same way other people discuss the weather. Calm, detached, controlled. Did you call to apologize? I asked. A small silence followed. Then she laughed softly. No, Eleanor. I called because Blake mentioned you left with some kind of box. Your grandfather collected antiques. Some of them are extremely valuable. I would hate for you to accidentally damage something important. There it was. Not concern. Curiosity. I glanced down at the box resting beneath my hands. I am sure you would, I said. Her voice sharpened slightly beneath the politeness. "Richard trusted me with family matters for years. If there is paperwork or financial material inside, it belongs with the attorneys." "Interesting," I replied calmly. "Then why did he leave it to me instead of you?" Silence again. Longer this time. Finally, she sighed. "You always were defensive." The line disconnected before I could answer. I sat there staring at my dark phone screen while memories surfaced one after another. Cynthia correcting the way I dressed at family dinners. Blake introducing me as the scholarship cousin during a holiday party in Connecticut. The uncomfortable smiles whenever I mentioned working 2 jobs while attending school. They had spent years making me feel temporary, as though I existed just outside the edges of the real family. But now, for the first time, they sounded nervous. I looked back toward the wooden box and slowly slid my finger beneath the brass latch. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside rested a silver pocket watch, a small brass key attached to a faded tag, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Beneath the envelope was one final item that made my stomach tighten instantly. A photograph. It showed my grandfather standing beside Walter Pierce in front of a private bank building in downtown Chicago. Written across the back in black ink were the words, "If they are already watching you, do not go home tomorrow." I barely slept that night. Every sound outside my apartment seemed sharper than usual. Car doors slamming, footsteps in the hallway, the distant rumble of delivery trucks before sunrise. Around 4 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to rest and sat near the kitchen window with my grandfather's envelope unopened beside a cold cup of coffee. The silver pocket watch rested in my palm, heavier than it looked, its polished surface reflecting the weak yellow light above the stove. When I pressed the small latch, the watch clicked open. Inside, instead of a photograph or engraving, there was a tiny folded piece of paper hidden beneath the cover. My pulse quickened as I carefully unfolded it. A single address was written in blue ink. Union Trust Bank, Chicago, Illinois. Beneath it was a time, 10:30 a.m. Friday. Today. I checked my phone immediately. 6:15 in the morning. A strange feeling settled over me then. Something between fear and clarity. My grandfather had planned this carefully. Every item in the box led somewhere else. Another instruction. Another warning. Another secret. I looked toward the sealed envelope again before finally opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 3 weeks before his death. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then events unfolded exactly as I expected. I know my family well enough to predict what they will do once money becomes involved. They will underestimate you. Let them. You must go to Chicago alone. Trust Walter Pierce only if he says the phrase your grandmother used to tell you when you were little." I stopped reading. For a second, confused. My grandmother died when I was 6 years old. I barely remembered her voice anymore. I continued slowly. "Do not contact anyone in the family. Do not tell anyone where you are going. And Eleanor, if you notice anyone following you, leave immediately." My stomach tightened as I lowered the letter. Suddenly the apartment felt too small, too exposed. I stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the street below. Morning traffic had started building outside. People hurried toward subway stations carrying briefcases and coffee cups while delivery vans double-parked near the corner deli. Everything looked normal until I noticed the black sedan parked across from my building. It had been there the night before. I remembered because the headlights flashed briefly while I unlocked the front door downstairs. Now it sat motionless at the curb with dark, tinted windows facing directly toward my apartment entrance. Maybe it meant nothing. Manhattan and Brooklyn were filled with black cars. Wealthy people treated them like taxis. But my grandfather's warning echoed too loudly in my head to ignore. "If they are already watching you, do not go home tomorrow." A sudden knock at my apartment door nearly made me drop the letter. 3 slow knocks. Controlled. Careful. My heart pounded as I stepped quietly toward the door without making a sound. Another knock followed. Then a woman's voice spoke softly through the hallway. "Miss Hayes." I froze instantly. I recognized the voice. Agnes Doyle, my grandfather's elderly housekeeper. "Please," she said quietly. "You do not have much time. They know about the box." I unlocked the door carefully, and Agnes Doyle stepped inside without waiting to be invited. She still wore the same dark gray coat she always used at my grandfather's estate in Connecticut, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a wool hat despite the early hour. Agnes had worked for Richard Hayes for more than 30 years. In a family filled with polished smiles and private agendas, she was one of the few people my grandfather genuinely trusted. The moment she entered my apartment, her eyes moved immediately toward the wooden box on the kitchen table. "Thank God," she whispered softly. "You opened it before they found a way to take it." I closed the door behind her. "What is happening?" I asked quietly. Agnes removed her gloves one finger at a time, her expression unusually tense. "Your grandfather knew there would be problems after his death. That is why he prepared everything so carefully." She looked toward the window overlooking the street. "Is the black sedan still outside?" My chest tightened instantly. "You saw it too?" Agnes nodded once. "I noticed it shortly after the will reading yesterday. Blake left the penthouse for nearly 20 minutes after you walked out. When he returned, he looked very pleased with himself." I stared at her in disbelief. "You think they are following me?" "I think your grandfather was frightened during his final weeks," she said carefully. "And Richard Hayes was not a man who frightened easily." Those words settled heavily in the room. My grandfather had negotiated billion-dollar deals, survived corporate scandals, and spent decades controlling one of the largest financial firms in the country. The idea that something inside his own family scared him felt impossible. Agnes stepped closer to the kitchen table and gently touched the silver pocket watch resting beside the envelope. "Do you remember what your grandmother used to tell you when you were upset?" she asked suddenly. I frowned slightly. "Not really. I was very young when she died." Agnes smiled faintly. "She always said, the loudest people are usually hiding the most." My breathing slowed. That was the phrase from the letter. Proof that Agnes knew more than she was saying. "Your grandfather trusted Walter Pierce because Walter helped create something the rest of the family never discovered," Agnes continued quietly. "But Richard believed someone inside the family learned pieces of the truth shortly before he died." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "What truth?" Agnes hesitated before answering. "The public will was never the real inheritance." Silence filled the apartment again except for the distant hum of dryers downstairs. I stared at her, unsure whether to feel confused or terrified. Agnes reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded train ticket. "Chicago. Departure at 8:45 that morning from Penn Station." "Flying is too easy to track," she said. "Your grandfather arranged this before his death. You were supposed to meet Walter Pierce at Union Trust Bank by 10:30 tomorrow morning." I looked at the ticket in disbelief. "You knew all this ahead of time?" "Only pieces," she admitted. "Richard told me if anything happened to him suddenly, I was to make sure you reached Chicago safely." My phone suddenly vibrated against the kitchen counter again. "Blake Hayes." Before I could silence it, a text message appeared beneath his name. "Careful who you trust, Eleanor. Grandfather kept dangerous secrets." Agnes saw the message too. Her face turned pale as she whispered quietly, "They know you are leaving." I packed everything in less than 15 minutes. 2 sweaters, my laptop, toiletries, the envelope, the silver watch, and the wooden box wrapped carefully inside my winter coat. Agnes stood near the kitchen window the entire time, watching the street below with growing concern. Every few minutes she adjusted the curtain slightly, checking whether the black sedan was still there. It never moved. "Do not take your phone," she said suddenly. I looked up from my bag. "What?" "Leave it here. Walter believes someone in the family may have access to location tracking through the Hayes Company accounts. If Blake or Cynthia are monitoring your devices, they will know the moment you reach Penn Station." The idea sounded paranoid, but after the past 24 hours, paranoia no longer felt unreasonable. I powered my phone off slowly and left it on the kitchen counter beside the cold coffee cup from earlier that morning. Agnes nodded approvingly. "Good. We leave separately." "Separately. If anyone is watching the building, we cannot give them a reason to connect us." She handed me a folded cash envelope. Inside was more money than I usually kept in my bank account. "Your grandfather prepared emergency funds months ago," she explained quietly. "He knew there might come a day when you needed to disappear quickly." I stared at the envelope in disbelief. How long was he planning this? Agnes lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "Longer than you realize." We exited the building through the laundromat entrance downstairs instead of the main lobby. Warm air carrying the scent of detergent rolled through the crowded room while machines rattled loudly against the tiled floor. Nobody looked twice at us as we stepped onto the busy sidewalk. The black sedan still waited across the street, parked exactly where it had been all morning. Its windows remained dark, motionless, watching. Agnes touched my arm gently. Walk to the corner diner. Wait exactly 5 minutes. Then take a cab to Penn Station. Do not look behind you. What about you? I asked. A faint smile crossed her tired face. I am old enough to know how people like the Hayes family operate. Before I could say anything else, she disappeared into the crowd moving along Flatbush Avenue. I stood there alone for a second, clutching my bag tightly before forcing myself to walk. Every sound suddenly felt amplified. Taxi horns, snippets of conversation, footsteps behind me. By the time I reached the diner, my heart was pounding hard enough to make my chest ache. I sat near the front window pretending to read the menu while secretly watching the street outside. At first everything looked normal. Then I saw him. Blake Hayes stepping out of a black SUV half a block away wearing sunglasses and a camel-colored overcoat despite the cloudy weather. My stomach dropped instantly. He looked directly toward my apartment building, speaking briefly into his phone before scanning the sidewalks around him. He was searching for me. I turned away from the window immediately and lowered my face toward the menu. A waitress approached asking if I wanted coffee, but I barely heard her. All I could think about was the fact that Blake had arrived less than 20 minutes after I left my phone behind, which meant one terrifying thing. Somebody had been monitoring me long before this morning. After exactly 5 minutes, I left cash on the table and walked quickly towards 7th Avenue without looking back. Penn Station was already crowded with commuters rushing beneath. Giant electronic departure boards and echoing announcements. I blended into the moving crowd as best I could, keeping my head down while gripping the train ticket tightly inside my coat pocket. Just before boarding, I noticed a man in a dark overcoat standing near the platform entrance watching passengers carefully one by one. The moment his eyes landed on me, his expression changed. Calm, focused, familiar. Then he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silver pocket watch identical to the one hidden inside my bag. I froze near the train platform as the man with the silver pocket watch continued watching me from across the crowded station. Around us, hundreds of commuters moved in every direction, dragging suitcases, carrying coffee, checking phones, completely unaware that my entire body had gone tense beneath my coat. The man looked to be somewhere in his late 50s, dressed in a charcoal overcoat with neatly combed gray hair and the calm posture of someone accustomed to being unnoticed. He never waved, never smiled. He simply held the watch open in his palm for 2 seconds before slipping it back into his pocket. Then he turned and boarded my train. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind again. Trust Walter Pierce only if he says the phrase your grandmother used to tell you. But this man was not Walter Pierce. At least not from the photographs I had seen growing up. Still, something about the pocket watch stopped me from walking away. I boarded carefully several cars behind him and found a seat near the back beside the window. The train slowly pulled out of Penn Station while Manhattan disappeared into gray winter clouds behind us. For the first hour, nothing happened. Business travelers typed on laptops. A child cried briefly somewhere farther down the aisle. Conductors checked tickets while announcements echoed softly overhead. But every time I glanced up, I noticed the gray-haired man occasionally looking toward me from 3 rows ahead. Calm, patient, waiting. Around noon, the cafe attendant rolled a snack cart down the aisle. As passengers shifted around to make room, someone quietly slipped into the empty seat beside me. Your grandmother used to say the loudest people are usually hiding the most. My breath caught instantly. I turned toward the man with the silver watch. Up close, his eyes looked tired but steady. Who are you? I whispered carefully. My name is Daniel Mercer, he replied. I worked with your grandfather for 22 years. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and handed me a business card. No company logo, no address, just his name and a Chicago phone number embossed in silver lettering. Richard asked me to make sure you reached Union Trust safely. I stared at him uncertainly. How do I know you are telling the truth? Daniel nodded slightly, almost like he expected the question. Because your grandfather knew Blake would follow the obvious routes first. Airports, credit cards, cell phones. He believed you would eventually understand that the family fortune everyone celebrated yesterday was only part of the story. Outside the train window, snowy fields blurred past beneath heavy clouds as we moved deeper into Pennsylvania. I tightened my grip on the wooden box resting inside my bag. What exactly did my grandfather hide? Daniel looked down briefly before answering. Not money. Control. He lowered his voice slightly. 3 months ago, Richard Hayes discovered unauthorized financial transfers inside Hayes Global. Millions of dollars moved through shell accounts connected to people inside the family. My stomach tightened instantly. Blake. Daniel hesitated. Your grandfather suspected more than one person. I thought about Cynthia's forced politeness. Blake appearing outside my apartment. The black sedan watching the building. Suddenly, every strange moment from the last 2 days felt connected by something far larger than inheritance. Daniel glanced carefully around the train car before continuing. Richard planned to expose everything quietly after updating the trust structure. But shortly before his death, he realized someone learned about the changes. What changes? I asked softly. Daniel met my eyes directly for the first time. The real controlling shares of Hayes Global were removed from the public estate months ago. I stared at him in disbelief. Who inherited them? Daniel's expression remained completely calm. That depends, he said quietly, on whether you survive long enough to claim them. The train arrived in Chicago just after 9 the next morning beneath a sky the color of steel. Snow drifted lightly across the station platforms, while freezing wind rushed through the streets outside. I followed Daniel Mercer through the crowded terminal, trying to look calm, even though my nerves felt stretched tighter with every passing hour. Since leaving New York, I had barely stopped thinking about his final words. That depends on whether you survive long enough to claim them. He had not sounded dramatic when he said it. That was what unsettled me most. He sounded practical, like someone describing weather conditions before a storm. Outside the station, Blacktown cars lined the curb while commuters hurried through clouds of white breath, carrying briefcases and winter coats pulled tightly around their shoulders. Daniel led me toward an older silver sedan parked half a block away instead of the luxury vehicles waiting nearby. Richard stopped trusting company drivers months ago, he explained while unlocking the doors. Too many loyalties can be purchased. As we drove through downtown Chicago, towering glass buildings reflected pale morning light across frozen sidewalks and traffic covered in slush. Daniel remained quiet for most of the ride, occasionally checking the mirrors behind us. I noticed him doing it often enough that eventually I asked, "Are we being followed?" "Not currently," he answered calmly. "That does not mean nobody is looking." 20 minutes later, we stopped in front of Union Trust Bank. The building looked nothing like the modern skyscrapers surrounding it. Dark stone walls, brass doors, narrow windows, old money, the kind that survives generations because nobody outside the family even knows it exists. Inside, the lobby was silent except for the soft ticking of a grandfather clock near the elevators. A receptionist in a navy suit looked up the moment we entered. "Miss Hayes," she said immediately, as though she had been expecting me for years. "Mr. Pierce is waiting upstairs." My chest tightened the moment I heard Walter Pierce's name again. Daniel pressed a small brass elevator button and turned toward me quietly. "Before you go upstairs, there is something you need to understand." I nodded slowly. "Your grandfather believed the public inheritance would distract the family long enough for you to reach this building safely. The millions distributed yesterday were never the true source of power." "Then what is?" I asked. Daniel looked directly at me. "Voting control. Hayes Global was secretly restructured through a private trust 6 months ago. Whoever controls that trust controls the company." The elevator doors opened softly behind us. "And my grandfather left it to me," I whispered. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "Richard believed you were the only person in the family who still understood the difference between wealth and greed." Upstairs, the private banking floor felt more like a luxury hotel than a financial institution. Thick carpets muted every footstep, while framed oil paintings lined the walls beneath soft golden lighting. At the end of the hallway, Walter Pierce stood waiting beside a pair of dark wooden doors. He looked older than he had during the will reading, as though the past 48 hours had aged him years. The moment he saw me, relief crossed his face briefly before disappearing again behind his usual professionalism. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "you made it." Before I could answer, another elevator opened somewhere behind us down the hallway. Several footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Walter's expression changed instantly. Sharp, alarmed. Then I heard a familiar voice speaking calmly from the other end of the corridor. "Well," Blake Hayes said with a slow smile, "this explains why you disappeared so suddenly." The hallway fell completely silent the moment Blake Hayes stepped closer. He looked perfectly composed in his tailored charcoal coat, one hand resting casually in his pocket as though this were nothing more than an inconvenient family misunderstanding. Behind him stood two men in dark suits near the elevator doors, both watching carefully without speaking. Walter Pierce immediately moved, half a step in front of me. "This is private property," he said firmly. Blake smiled faintly. "Relax, Walter. I am not here to cause a scene." His eyes shifted toward me. Calm, confident. "You disappeared from New York without even saying goodbye, Eleanor." Aunt Cynthia was worried. I almost laughed at that. Cynthia Hayes worrying about me was like a shark worrying about the ocean. Blake stepped forward slowly, lowering his voice. "You do not understand what grandfather was involved in." "Then explain it," I replied quietly. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, Blake's expression tightened slightly. "Richard built his empire by controlling people. Politicians. Executives. Entire companies. You think the family inheritance was complicated? You have not even seen the beginning." Walter Pierce interrupted sharply. "That is enough." Blake ignored him completely. "Whatever Walter told you is incomplete. Grandfather changed the trust structure before he died, yes. But he was not thinking clearly during his final months." Daniel Mercer stiffened beside me. "Careful," he warned quietly. Blake exhaled impatiently. "You all keep pretending Richard Hayes was some wise old king protecting his legacy. He was paranoid. He trusted almost nobody by the end." "Including you?" I asked. Blake looked directly at me. "Especially me." That answer surprised me enough to make me pause. For one brief second, his confidence slipped, and something else appeared underneath it. Anger, hurt, maybe even fear. "Do you know what it is like growing up inside this family?" he continued quietly. "Every conversation becomes a transaction. Every achievement becomes competition. Grandfather spent years testing people against each other like pieces on a chessboard." Walter opened the large wooden doors behind us. "Miss Hayes, we need to proceed now." Blake's eyes shifted toward the room beyond the doorway. Whatever calm expression he had maintained disappeared instantly. "So it is true," he said softly. "He really left it to you." My pulse quickened. "Left me what?" Walter looked at me carefully before answering. "Everything that actually matters." Inside the private conference room stood a single long table beneath warm golden lighting. On the far wall, several monitors displayed legal documents filled with corporate seals and financial records. At the center of the table rested a thick black folder embossed with the Hayes Global logo. Walter closed the doors behind us, while Blake remained outside in the hallway staring through the glass panels with growing disbelief. 6 months ago, Walter began quietly. "Your grandfather transferred controlling voting authority for Hayes Global into a private trust inaccessible through the public estate." He placed the folder slowly in front of me. "The beneficiary listed in that trust is Eleanor Hayes." My hands went still against the table. Walter opened the folder carefully, revealing pages of signatures and legal documents worth billions of dollars. Richard believed wealth should belong to the person least corrupted by it. Outside the glass doors, Blake looked pale now, no longer arrogant or amused, just stunned. Walter slid the final document toward me along with a silver pen. "Miss Hayes," he said calmly, "your grandfather spent years preparing for this moment. The moment you sign these papers, you become the controlling owner of Hayes Global."